a further look into the precursors of Metroidvania. "1984 might have been the year of Big Brother, but as far as exploratory action games were concerned, it was also a year of significant advancement. 3 major releases debuted in the US and Japan, all very different in design, but all highly influential works for what would come to be known as the Metroidvania. The idea of adding exploration to the run-and-jump platformer was completely natural. You're moving a character around the screen, trying to lead them to a goal. But what if that character didn't reach their goal by simply running left to right? What if they could break out of their linear track? What if there were more to the world than simply the path between points A and B? We've already looked at Pitfall, David Crane's Atari 2600 adventure, which took the single-screen navigation of Donkey Kong and spread it across 265 screens. While Pitfall's world existed as an infinite linear loop, that loop contains obstructions, detours, and secret passageways, becoming a sort of environmental puzzle. For the sequel, Crane expanded on this puzzle concept even further. One of the final major releases for Atari 2600, Pitfall II, turned out to be so ambitious in scope that it exceeded the base capabilities of the console. As with next-generation exploratory Nintendo games like Metroid and ZELDA, Pitfall II wouldn't have been possible with the system's stock hardware. Publisher Activision stuffed the cartridge with more memory to house the game's expansive world and a special chip that boosted the complexity of the system's sound output, allowing Pitfall II to accompany its action with a rousing, dynamic ditty rather than the ear-splitting screeches and blips for which the 2600 was known. It's an innovative, landmark game, especially in light of the fact that it abandons the concept of lives and timers altogether. In some ways, Pitfall II feels more like a modern-era indie game with its forgiving design. Although cave-dwelling critters remain hazardous as ever, when players bump into a bat or an eel, they simply find themselves flung back to the latest checkpoint they've crossed. You can fling yourself against Pitfall's 2 underground caverns indefinitely until you win. The challenge inherent in this game demanded not nimble dexterity, but rather observation and thoroughness. The lost caverns are packed with treasure, just like the first game's jungle, and each treasure nets Pitfall Harry a certain number of points. You lose points when you bump into a hazard, though, meaning the goal of Pitfall 2 is ultimately to find all 199,000 points worth of treasure hidden throughout the caverns and reach the end without a single point being docked. Despite the game's forgiving design, that is not an easy task. Pitfall 2 has the most complex video game world that had ever been seen outside of games like Zork, and certainly the most intricate environment ever to appear in a run-and-jump action game to that point. Crane once again designed about 256 screens for Pitfall Harry to navigate, but this time those screens aren't strung out along an endless horizontal loop. Instead, Pitfall 2 emphasizes verticality. The world of the Lost Caverns spans only 8 screens across, but that's just the surface. Rather than running parallel to the surface route, the underground is now a series of caves that descend a whopping 27 floors below the surface. Pitfall 2's caverns interlock and interconnect, becoming a sort of spatial puzzle. You can see multiple levels of cavern on each screen, but you can't always reach the spaces you can see right away. Walls, pits, and ceilings work together to turn the subterranean caves into a maze. There are basically 3 columns of dense caverns underground, each separated by a screen-wide section of empty space. Pitfall Harry has developed the remarkable ability to survive a fall from any height, so completing Pitfall 2 becomes a matter of taking bold leaps and plunges in order to cross the chasms and reach otherwise inaccessible areas. An underground river at the bottom of the caverns creates a sort of conduit that allows Harry to cross back to the rightmost column of caves and ladders if he messes up. The game requires a bit of patience, but there's a real sense of satisfaction when you finally figure out the path you need to take in order to reach some seemingly out-of-the-way treasure. Pitfall 2 is also notable in that it isn't simply a treasure hunt. Ultimately, you only need to find a single specific treasure, a diamond ring, and rescue Harry's niece and pet mountain lion in order to win. The real task at hand here is exploration and navigation of a huge and complex series of caverns. More than any other of the Roots games we've explored to date, Pitfall 2 truly does feel like the proper progenitor to the Metroidvania genre. Its world is vastly larger and more complex than that of even Montezuma's Revenge. But unlike Zork, its interface and vocabulary are entirely based around action, but not overtly arcade-style action. It's a game that allows you to explore, challenges you to take notes, and gives you the freedom to do so at your own pace. Given the game's late release and the obscurity of the 2600 console in Japan, where it had launched belatedly around the same time as the Famicom under the name Atari 2800, Pitfall II probably wasn't a direct influence on the core Metroidvania games. But looking at what Crane had accomplished on the humble 2600, it's impossible not to be impressed with his work. And it's also easy to see how the drive to turn action platform games into journeys through larger, persistent spaces was a universal creative impulse. Why Metroidvania comes as natural to game designers as breathing. Meanwhile, over in Japan, two seminal action RPGs debuted around the same time as Pitfall II. Falcom's Dragon Slayer and TNE Soft's Hydlide. Neither of these games have as much bearing on the Metroidvania genre as Pitfall II does, but they're worth examining simply to track the evolution of the action role-playing genre, which would converge with platformers once the Metroidvania format took off in earnest. We've already looked at the Game Boy port of Dragon Slayer over in Game Boy Works, and the original PC 88 rendition of the game was fundamentally the same as that conversion, albeit a lot more primitive looking. The premise here is that you are a tiny warrior in a large world seeking to defeat a handful of deadly dragons. The core gameplay loop of Dragon Slayer revolves around powering up your tiny warrior. He begins the game in a terribly fragile state, and the monsters that beset him can tear him to ribbons in seconds. Survival is dependent on boosting his experience levels, which you accomplish by retrieving certain items within the maze the warrior inhabits, then toting them back to his home. It's reminiscent of the mechanic in early RPGs whereby characters couldn't cash in on their experience and level up until they reached a resting point, like a town or campfire. Dragon Slayer simply takes that a step further by tying the process of earning experience to the resting point. Enemies don't net you experience, and in fact, killing weak enemies is a bad idea because it causes them to respawn as more powerful versions somewhere in the maze. Instead, Dragon Slayer becomes about navigating the maze space efficiently. Your tiny warrior with his tiny hands can only carry a single item at a time, so completing the adventure involves a lot of swapping and dropping. You would think that it's a good idea to tote the enemy-repelling cross with you everywhere you go for safety, but you can't lug around an experience token back to your home while you do so. So there's a trade-off involved, one that becomes even trickier as the world opens up and you have to roam further afield in order to advance. The hero here curiously has the ability to lift and carry his home around with him, hermit crab style, which adds another element of complexity to the navigation. It's a strange game, but it absolutely feels like a progeny of Atari's adventure, and it demonstrates the continuing evolution of the action RPG. So too does Hydlide, which was inspired by Namco's strange arcade hit, The Tower of Druaga. Honestly, Druaga probably could have been covered in this series since it's basically a combination of Pac-Man and Exidy's Venture. But Druaga didn't quite make the cut because its regimented, stage-by-stage design, while perfect for arcades, doesn't really allow players to explore and grow. Hydlide, on the other hand, doesn't have multiple stages, only a single world. The world of Hydlide consists of an overworld, a 5x5 grid of screens that loops around in all directions, plus multiple underground passages and dungeons. It's a highly condensed role-playing experience with stats, including experience, depicted as a series of simple meters on the side of the screen. Combat consists of walking into foes with your sword drawn, similar to Namco's Druaga, though here you can also earn magic. Unlike in Druaga, there is an experience system at work. It takes ages to level up your little hero, but you can grind all you want and save your level ups with a password. At least on the NES version anyway, which was an enhanced version of the original called Hydlide Special. Hydlide debuted in the US in 1988, which was well past its prime. But in 1984, it had been a pretty impressive work. It neatly distilled the essence of games like Ultima and the Black ONYX into an easy-to-grasp action format. Truth be told, there's not really much to Hydlide. The quest involves a simple chain of progression for key items that need to be acquired and used in order to complete the quest. Most of the playtime involves grinding for level ups and hunting around obscure corners of the world for critical acquisitions. But you can definitely see Metroidvania-ish concepts at play here, with tools that open new areas and features in a world you can more or less freely roam from the outset. Unlike Pitfall II, this game did have a direct impact on early Metroidvanias, having been a sizable hit on Japanese home computers and helping to fuel the nation's collective thirst for exploration. Next time on Metroidvania Works, a little more action RPG dalliance before we finally get to the first half of the word Metroidvania.